The village of Alderwick had, for many years, taken a quiet pride in its consistency. Nothing of consequence ever occurred abruptly. Even minor disturbances arrived softened by courtesy and diluted by time. It was, therefore, not immediately recognized on the afternoon in question that anything had gone wrong at all. The luncheon at Briarwood House began, as such things do, with polite punctuality and an unspoken agreement that no one would mention the weather until absolutely necessary. Mrs. Dalrymple arrived first, carrying with her the faint expectation of admiration that accompanies a new hat. It was a narrow-brimmed thing, modest in colour but ambitious in angle, and she positioned herself in the drawing-room so that the light would fall upon it in what she hoped was a flattering manner. "Charming," said Miss Verity Sloane, who had entered moments later and possessed the particular talent of making agreement sound faintly corrective. "Quite modern, I think." Mrs. Dalrymple inclined her head, accepting this with measured satisfaction. At the far end of the room, Mr. Arthur Penbury adjusted his cuffs with unnecessary attention, as though the act itself might establish his importance within the gathering. He had been invited, it was understood, not for his conversation, which tended toward prolonged explanation, but for his proximity to certain financial interests that the host found occasionally useful. The host himself, Mr. Lionel Ashcombe, entered shortly thereafter, bringing with him the subdued authority of a man accustomed to being listened to, though not always agreed with. "My dear friends," he said, in a tone that suggested both warmth and calculation, "how very good of you to come." There followed the usual exchange of acknowledgments, each one calibrated to convey neither too much enthusiasm nor too little regard. Hovering just beyond the immediate circle of conversation stood the butler, Mr. Edwin Harrow. He had been in service at Briarwood House for nearly 2 decades, and during that time had achieved something rare. He had become both indispensable and invisible. His movements were precise without being noticeable, his presence reassuring without inviting attention. One did not think of Mr. Harrow so much as one relied upon him, in the same way one relies upon the stability of the floor beneath one's feet. "Sherry, madam?" he asked Mrs. Dalrymple, who accepted with the faintest inclination of her fingers. To observe him was to observe a kind of quiet competence that asked for nothing and revealed less. It was perhaps for this reason that no one, at that moment, thought to look at him closely. The luncheon progressed to the dining-room with a smoothness that suggested careful rehearsal, though no rehearsal had, in fact, taken place. The table was laid with restrained elegance, polished silver, unassuming china, and a floral arrangement that seemed to apologize for its own presence. Conversation unfolded in the expected manner. There were remarks about travel that avoided detail, opinions on literature that avoided disagreement, and occasional pauses in which cutlery was allowed to speak in place of its users. It was Miss Sloane who first introduced the subject of absence. "Is Mrs. Ashcombe unwell?" she asked, with the deliberate casualness of someone who had already considered several possible answers. Mr. Ashcombe paused briefly before replying. "My wife is resting," he said. "She has been somewhat fatigued of late." There was a murmur of sympathetic acknowledgment, though its sincerity varied. "How trying," said Mrs. Dalrymple, adjusting her napkin with a precision that suggested she did not find it trying at all. Mr. Penbury cleared his throat. "Health is a most delicate matter," he began, with the air of someone preparing to expand upon the subject at length. At this point, the butler reappeared at Mr. Ashcombe's side, leaning just sufficiently to speak without being overheard. What he said was not heard by the others, but it had the effect of introducing a subtle interruption into the flow of the meal. Mr. Ashcombe's expression altered not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the balance of the afternoon had shifted by some small, almost imperceptible degree. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his chair. There was no immediate alarm. Hosts excused themselves for any number of reasons, most of them trivial and all of them politely ignored. The conversation resumed, though with a slight unevenness, as if each participant were aware, without quite acknowledging that something had been removed from the room. Miss Sloane observed the empty chair with a degree of interest that bordered on curiosity. "Do you suppose," she said, not addressing anyone in particular, "that fatigue can arrive so suddenly?" Mrs. Dalrymple considered this. "It is often convenient," she replied. Mr. Penbury, who had been preparing a remark about the seasonal variation in ailments, found himself uncertain as to whether it remained appropriate. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrow continued his duties. He refilled glasses, adjusted plates, and attended to each guest with the same measured composure he had always displayed. If there was anything unusual in his manner, it was so slight as to be indistinguishable from his usual restraint. And yet, there was something. Not in what he did, but in what he did not do. He did not meet Miss Sloane's gaze when she looked toward him. He did not correct the slight misplacement of a fork until several moments later than would have been expected. He did not, at any point, allow himself to pause. Time, in such settings, has a curious elasticity. Minutes may pass unnoticed or stretch themselves into something more substantial, depending upon the degree of attention paid to them. It was therefore difficult to say precisely how long Mr. Ashcombe had been absent when the sound was heard. It was not loud. It was not even, in the strictest sense, alarming. It was a disturbance of the sort that might easily have been dismissed under ordinary circumstances, a dull, uncertain noise from somewhere beyond the dining room, lacking both clarity and explanation. The guests paused, not abruptly, but in the gradual way that attention gathers itself. "Did you?" began Mrs. Dalrymple. "I heard something," said Mr. Penbury, though without conviction. Miss Sloane did not speak. She was watching the butler. Mr. Harrow had stopped. For the first time that afternoon, he was entirely still. It lasted only a moment. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, as though acknowledging something privately understood, he resumed his duties. "Shall I bring coffee in the drawing-room?" he asked. His voice was unchanged. His tone was, if anything, more composed than before, and it was precisely this composure that introduced, quite gently and without announcement, the first real discomfort of the afternoon. No one objected. No one insisted on investigating the noise. No one suggested that anything might be wrong. Instead, they allowed themselves to be guided by habit, by politeness, and perhaps by something less easily named back into the familiar structure of the day. They rose. They moved. They spoke of small things. And in doing so, they permitted the luncheon to continue, even as it had already, in some quiet and irreversible way, come to an end. The drawing-room at Briarwood House had been arranged to encourage a certain kind of conversation, one that moved lightly across subjects without settling too firmly on any of them. The chairs were placed at angles that suggested intimacy without commitment, and the small tables bore just enough ornamentation to occupy the eye when words proved insufficient. Coffee was served with a quiet efficiency that restored, at least superficially, the order of the afternoon. Mr. Harrow moved among them as he always had, placing cups with careful attention, offering sugar without assumption, and withdrawing at precisely the moment his presence might have been acknowledged. If his stillness in the dining-room had been remarked upon, it was not referred to now. Indeed, it seemed to have dissolved into the general atmosphere, absorbed by the larger effort to maintain normality. Mrs. Dalrymple accepted her coffee with a measured nod. "One does wonder," she began, stirring her cup though she had declined sugar, "whether such interruptions are ever quite accidental." Miss Sloane, seated opposite her, regarded this with mild interest. "Interruptions rarely are," she said, "though one is often encouraged to treat them as such." Mr. Penbury, who had taken a position near the window, shifted slightly. "I should think," he said, "that houses of this size are prone to all manner of sounds, settling, as it were. Old structures have their peculiarities." "Indeed," said Miss Sloane, "though one does not usually excuse oneself so promptly for a settling beam. There was a brief pause. It was not an uncomfortable one, precisely, but it carried with it a faint suggestion that the conversation might, if left unattended, arrive somewhere inconvenient. Mrs. Dalrymple set her cup down. "Mr. Ashcombe has always been most attentive," she said, as though offering a correction to an unspoken criticism. "I cannot imagine he would leave his guests without good reason." "No," Miss Sloane agreed. "One cannot imagine it." The agreement was so exact as to invite reconsideration. Mr. Penbury cleared his throat again, a habit he employed when uncertain whether to contribute or withdraw. "I had understood," he said, "that Mrs. Ashcombe's health had been delicate for some time. It is possible, of course, that the matter concerns her." "Possible?" said Miss Sloane, with a slight inclination of her head, "though one might then expect some mention of it." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned very slightly. "It would hardly be appropriate," she said, "to discuss such matters in front of guests." "Appropriateness," Miss Sloane replied, "is often a matter of timing." The conversation drifted, as conversations do, towards safer ground. There was a brief discussion of a recent charity event in which several of those present had participated with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Mrs. Dalrymple spoke of the arrangements with a careful modesty that suggested she had played a more significant role than she wished to declare. "It was all quite simple," she said. "A matter of coordination." "Coordination can be remarkably complex," observed Miss Sloane. "Yes," said Mr. Penbury, "particularly when one is dealing with multiple interests." The phrase lingered slightly, as though it had been offered with more intention than was immediately apparent. Miss Sloane turned her attention to him. "You have had experience of such matters, I believe?" "A certain amount," he replied, with what he perhaps intended as restraint, though it bordered on self-importance. "One encounters, in financial circles, a variety of competing considerations." "Competing," she repeated. "Well," he said, adjusting his cuff again, "not always competing, occasionally merely misaligned." "Misalignment can be most inconvenient," she said. Mrs. Dalrymple glanced between them. "I am sure," she said, "that Mr. Ashcombe manages his affairs very effectively." "I have no doubt of it," Miss Sloane replied. There was, again, that slight precision in her tone. At the far side of the room, near the mantel, stood a small writing desk. It had not been in use during the afternoon, but its presence suggested a capacity for communication that extended beyond the immediate company. Miss Sloane's gaze rested upon it briefly. "Does Mr. Ashcombe conduct much of his business from here?" she asked. Mr. Penbury followed her glance. "From time to time," he said, "though I believe he prefers to keep such matters separate from his domestic arrangements." "A sensible preference," said Mrs. Dalrymple. "And yet," Miss Sloane continued, "such separations are not always entirely successful." Mr. Penbury shifted again. "I should not care to speculate," he said. "No," she agreed. "Speculation is rarely useful." The remark might have ended there, had it not been for the faintest hesitation that followed it, as though something had been considered and set aside. Mrs. Dalrymple, perhaps sensing this, turned the conversation once more. "I recall," she said, "that the Ashcombes engaged Mr. Harrow some years ago under rather particular circumstances." Mr. Harrow, who had just entered with a small tray of biscuits, did not react. "Did they?" said Miss Sloane. "So I was told," Mrs. Dalrymple continued. "He came highly recommended, though I never learned by whom." "Recommendations are curious things," Miss Sloane observed. "They tell one a great deal about the person offering them, and very little about the person receiving them." Mr. Penbury accepted a biscuit. "I have always found Mr. Harrow to be most reliable," he said. "As have we all," Mrs. Dalrymple agreed. There was a moment in which the statement seemed to settle over the room, not as a conclusion, but as a kind of assumption that had never been examined. Miss Sloane watched the butler as he moved away. Reliability, she said, almost to herself, is a quality that becomes visible only in its absence. No one replied immediately. The clock on the mantel marked the passing of another minute with a soft, unobtrusive sound. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, though not enough to be remarked upon. Within the room, the conversation continued. It touched briefly on travel again, then on literature, and then, quite without announcement, on the subject of memory. "It is remarkable," Mrs. Dalrymple said, "how differently people recall the same event." "Remarkable," Miss Sloane echoed. "I remember," Mr. Penbury began, "a dinner some years ago in which—" He stopped, not because he had forgotten what he meant to say, but because, at that precise moment, the door opened. Mr. Ashcombe stood there. He had returned without ceremony, and yet his presence altered the room at once. "My apologies," he said, his voice composed, though lacking its earlier ease. "An unexpected matter required my attention." "Of course," said Mrs. Dalrymple. "We quite understand," added Mr. Penbury. Miss Sloane said nothing. Mr. Ashcombe moved into the room. "Please," he said, with a gesture that invited them to remain seated, though none had risen. "I trust you have not been inconvenienced." "Not at all," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. There was a brief exchange of polite reassurances. Then, as though the moment demanded it, Mr. Ashcombe added, "I am afraid that luncheon has been somewhat curtailed. There has been a small incident." The word was chosen carefully. "Nothing serious, I hope?" said Mr. Penbury. Mr. Ashcombe paused. "No," he said, "not serious." And yet, in the space between the word and its acceptance, something lingered, something that did not align entirely with the tone in which it had been delivered. Miss Sloane regarded him steadily. "One finds," she said, "that the definition of seriousness can vary." Mr. Ashcombe met her gaze briefly. "Yes," he said, "it can." The conversation did not end there, but from that point onward, it no longer concerned nothing in particular. The word incident did not disperse easily. It remained in the room with a persistence that polite conversation could not entirely dissolve, attaching itself to each remark and lending it a quiet uncertainty. Mr. Ashcombe did not elaborate at once. Instead, he accepted the coffee Mr. Harrow placed beside him and thanked him with a slight inclination of the head. The exchange was perfectly ordinary, and yet it carried a curious weight, as though both men were participating in something not entirely visible to the others. Miss Sloane observed it without appearing to do so. "One finds," she said after a moment, "that small incidents have a tendency to enlarge themselves if left unattended." "That will not be necessary here," Mr. Ashcombe replied, a shade more firmly than his earlier tone. "The matter is already in hand." Mrs. Dalrymple, who had begun to feel that the conversation was straying toward a degree of specificity she did not prefer, adjusted her position. "I am sure," she said, "that everything is quite under control." "Yes," said Mr. Penbury quickly, "quite." Mr. Ashcombe gave a brief nod, as though acknowledging a sentiment rather than confirming a fact. "It would be best," he added, "if we did not allow it to disturb the remainder of the afternoon." This suggestion, presented as a courtesy, carried with it a subtle instruction. No one objected, and yet the absence of objection did not restore ease. Mr. Harrow, meanwhile, had resumed his place near the sideboard. He stood with his hands lightly folded, his posture neither rigid nor relaxed, but held in that careful balance which service had long since made habitual. If he had any awareness of the conversation, he gave no sign of it. Miss Sloane allowed her gaze to rest on him briefly. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her tone conversational, "you have been with the Ashcombes for some time, I believe." There was nothing in the question that required hesitation. 17 years, madam," he replied. "Then you must know the house very well." "I endeavour to, madam." The answer was precise, neither expansive nor evasive. "One might suppose," she continued, "that nothing of consequence occurs here without your noticing it." There was a pause so slight that it might have been imagined. "One notices what is required, madam," he said. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, approving nod. "A most sensible approach." Mr. Pembury shifted slightly in his chair. "I have always found," he said, "that discretion is the cornerstone of good service." "Yes," Miss Sloane agreed, "though it is an interesting cornerstone. It supports a structure without ever being seen." Mr. Harrow did not respond. His silence was not unusual. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with his position. And yet, in the present context, it seemed to possess a different quality, less a matter of professional restraint than of deliberate absence. Mr. Ashcombe set down his cup. "That will be all for now, Harrow," he said. "Yes, sir." The butler inclined his head and withdrew. His departure, like his presence, was executed without disturbance. The door closed quietly behind him, and for a moment the room seemed to expand slightly, as though accommodating the space he had vacated. Mrs. Dalrymple exhaled, though she had not appeared to be holding her breath. "A most reliable man," she said again, as if the repetition might secure the statement against doubt. Miss Sloane did not immediately reply. Instead, she rose and moved toward the window, where the light had begun to soften into something more reflective than illuminating. "Reliability," she said at last, "is often attributed to those who give us no reason to question it." Mr. Pembury frowned faintly. "I should think that is precisely what makes it valuable." "Yes?" she said. "Precisely." Mr. Ashcombe rose as well. "If you will excuse me once more," he said, "I find that there are still one or two matters requiring attention." There was no protest. Indeed, his absence now seemed less remarkable than before, as though the pattern of the afternoon had adjusted itself to accommodate it. When he had gone, the room settled into a quieter arrangement. Mrs. Dalrymple returned her attention to her cup, though she did not drink. Mr. Pembury stood near the mantel, examining an object he did not appear to see. Miss Sloane remained at the window. It was she who spoke next. "Did either of you notice," she said, "the manner in which Mr. Harrow received the message?" Mr. Pembury looked up. "I cannot say that I did." Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated. "He seemed, as he always does." "Yes," Miss Sloane said. "That is what makes it interesting." "In what way?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked. In that, he did not ask a question. Mr. Pembury considered this. "Why should he?" "Because," Miss Sloane replied, "most people would." There was a brief silence. Mrs. Dalrymple set her cup down again, this time with a slightly more decisive movement. "I cannot see that it signifies anything," she said. "Nor can I," Mr. Pembury added. Miss Sloane turned from the window. "Of course not," she said. Her agreement was so readily given that it seemed to close the matter. And yet, it did not quite do so. A few minutes later, the door opened once more. Mr. Harrow re-entered the room. "There is a message, sir," he said, addressing Mr. Ashcombe's absence, as though it were a temporary inconvenience rather than a notable condition. "For Mr. Ashcombe?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked. "Yes, madam. He is not here at present." "I am aware, madam." The reply was courteous, but it contained no further information. Miss Sloane watched him. "Shall we take it?" she asked. Mr. Harrow inclined his head slightly. "I have been instructed to deliver it directly, madam." "Of course," she said. There was nothing in his tone to suggest reluctance, and yet the effect was unmistakable. He would not deviate from his instructions. Even now, he remained by the door, neither advancing nor withdrawing, as though his position were defined not by the room but by the task he had been given. Mrs. Dalrymple rose, perhaps with the intention of bridging what she perceived as an awkwardness. "I am sure Mr. Ashcombe will return shortly," she said. "I expect so, madam." Time passed. Not long, but long enough to make itself felt. Mr. Pembury glanced at the clock. Miss Sloane did not move. Mr. Harrow did not shift his position. At last, footsteps were heard in the corridor. Mr. Ashcombe reappeared, his expression composed, though not entirely restored. "Harrow," he said. The butler stepped forward and handed him a small envelope. Mr. Ashcombe took it, glanced briefly at the contents, and then folded it once before placing it in his pocket. "Thank you." "Yes, sir." There was a moment in which it seemed possible that something might be said. Nothing was. Mr. Harrow withdrew once more, and with him the opportunity for explanation, for interruption, for anything that might have altered the quiet progression of the afternoon, seemed to recede as well. What remained was not silence, exactly, but something very close to it. It was Mrs. Dalrymple who first attempted to restore the tone of the afternoon, though the effort, while determined, did not entirely succeed. "One must not allow small disturbances to linger," she said, with the air of someone who believed firmly in the usefulness of such statements. "They have a way of enlarging themselves quite unnecessarily." "Indeed," said Mr. Penbury, though his agreement arrived a fraction too quickly. "Quite unnecessary." Miss Sloane resumed her seat, folding her hands lightly in her lap. "Enlargement," she said, "is rarely the fault of the disturbance itself." Mrs. Dalrymple smiled, though not without effort. "You always take a most analytical view of things." "I find it economical," Miss Sloane replied. The remark, though mild, introduced a pause. Mr. Ashcombe remained standing for a moment longer than was strictly required, as though considering whether his presence was expected to carry the conversation forward. When he did sit, it was with a deliberation that suggested the decision had not been entirely straightforward. "I trust," he said, "that you have found everything to your satisfaction." The question, being general, invited a general response. "Entirely," said Mrs. Dalrymple. "Most agreeable," added Mr. Penbury. Miss Sloane inclined her head. "Quite so." The uniformity of their replies did not appear to reassure him. Outside, the light had shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to alter the character of the room. The corners seemed slightly more pronounced, the spaces between objects a little more defined. Mr. Penbury moved toward the window as though drawn by the change. "A pleasant afternoon," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple agreed. "Very." Miss Sloane did not look toward the window. Instead, her attention rested briefly on the door through which Mr. Harrow had last departed. "There is a certain advantage," she said, "in knowing precisely what is expected of one." Mr. Ashcombe glanced at her. "I should think so. It removes the possibility of error." "Or," he said, "conceals it." There was a moment in which neither spoke. Mrs. Dalrymple, sensing the direction of the exchange, rose from her chair. "I believe," she said, "that a little fresh air would be beneficial." "An excellent idea," said Mr. Penbury at once. Mr. Ashcombe stood. "Of course, the garden is at your disposal." They moved toward the terrace doors, their progress marked by the faint rearrangement of chairs and the soft sound of fabric against wood. The transition from room to garden was accomplished without difficulty, though it carried with it a subtle sense of relief. Outside, the air was cooler than expected. The garden at Briarwood House had been designed with a careful regard for symmetry, though time had introduced small irregularities that gave it a degree of character. The paths did not quite align as they once had, and certain borders had grown beyond their intended limits. Mrs. Dalrymple paused near a cluster of late-season flowers. "Charming," she said. "Yes," Mr. Penbury agreed, though his attention was divided. Miss Sloane walked a little further, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. Mr. Ashcombe remained near the doorway. It was not immediately apparent whether he intended to join them. "There is a seat by the yew hedge," Mrs. Dalrymple suggested, turning slightly. "One can sit quite comfortably there." "Thank you," he said. "Perhaps in a moment." She inclined her head and continued. The garden, though orderly, did not entirely dispel the unease that had settled over the afternoon. It merely redistributed it, placing it among the hedges and along the paths, where it might be encountered in smaller, more manageable portions. Mr. Penbury followed Mrs. Dalrymple, though he did so with a certain hesitation, as though uncertain whether his presence was required or merely expected. Miss Sloane, having reached the yew hedge, paused. "One finds," she said, as the others approached, "that discomfort rarely announces itself directly." Mrs. Dalrymple seated herself. "I am not uncomfortable," she said. "No," Miss Sloane agreed. "Of course not." Mr. Penbury remained standing. "I should think," he said, "that we are all perfectly at ease." "Perfectly," she said. The word rested lightly, though not without implication. From the terrace, Mr. Ashcombe watched them. It was possible to imagine that he was considering whether to speak again, though, if so, he did not act upon it. Instead, he turned slightly, as though his attention had been drawn elsewhere. At that moment, a figure appeared at the far edge of the garden path. It was a maid young and moving with a degree of urgency that she seemed to be attempting, without complete success, to moderate. She approached Mr. Ashcombe directly. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice. The others could not hear what followed. They could, however, observe the effect. Mr. Ashcombe's posture altered not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the balance of the afternoon had shifted once more. "Yes," he said. The maid nodded. "Yes, sir." She withdrew, retracing her steps with the same careful urgency. Mr. Ashcombe remained where he was for a moment, his gaze directed not toward the garden, but toward the house. Miss Sloane had turned. "More interruptions?" she asked, her tone light. "Nothing of consequence," he replied. Mrs. Dalrymple smiled. "These things have a way of resolving themselves." "Yes," he said, "they do." Mr. Penbury shifted his weight. "I wonder," he said, "whether we ought—" He did not finish the sentence. Miss Sloane regarded him. "Ought to what?" To make ourselves useful." The suggestion hung briefly in the air. Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "I cannot imagine that we are required." "No," Miss Sloane said. "I do not think we are." Mr. Ashcombe stepped forward. "Please," he said, "do not concern yourselves. Everything is quite in hand." The repetition of the phrase did not carry the reassurance it had perhaps been intended to convey. Miss Sloane rose. "Then we shall remain unconcerned," she said. Her tone was courteous. It was also very slightly precise. Mr. Ashcombe inclined his head. "Thank you." The garden, for a time, resumed its quiet. The air moved gently among the hedges. A bird crossed the path and disappeared into the trees. Mrs. Dalrymple spoke of flowers again. Mr. Penbury responded, though without conviction. Miss Sloane said very little, and through it all, the sense persisted not of alarm, but of something less easily defined, a discomfort so small as to be almost imperceptible, and yet, once noticed, impossible to entirely ignore. The suggestion of returning indoors arose not from any expressed discomfort, but from the quiet recognition that the garden, for all its order, no longer provided sufficient distraction. "It may be cooler inside," Mrs. Dalrymple observed, rising with a deliberation that suggested the matter had already been decided. "Yes," said Mr. Penbury, who seemed relieved to have something definite to agree with. Miss Sloane turned her gaze briefly toward the house, then inclined her head. "As you wish." Mr. Ashcombe had already moved toward the terrace doors. He held one open, allowing the others to pass before him, a gesture of courtesy that felt, under the circumstances, almost like a necessity. The drawing-room received them with its earlier arrangement intact, though something in its atmosphere had altered. The air seemed closer, the objects within it slightly more pronounced, as though their familiarity had become a form of emphasis. "Perhaps tea," Mrs. Dalrymple suggested, once they had resumed their places. "It is the proper conclusion to any unsettled afternoon." Mr. Ashcombe paused. "Yes," he said. "Tea." He did not ring for it. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, he crossed the room and rang the bell himself. The sound, though soft, carried distinctly. It was not long before Mr. Harrow entered. If there had been any change in him, it was not immediately visible. His expression remained composed, his movements precise. "T. Harrow," said Mr. Ashcombe. "Yes, sir." There was no inquiry, no repetition of the instruction. He inclined his head and withdrew. Mrs. Dalrymple adjusted her gloves. "I always find," she said, "that tea restores proportion." "Does it?" Miss Sloane asked. "It reminds one," Mrs. Dalrymple continued, "that certain things proceed as they should." Mr. Penbury nodded. "Quite so." Miss Sloane did not reply. Her attention had returned, almost imperceptibly, to the door. When Mr. Harrow re-entered, he carried the tray with the same steady assurance as before. The cups were arranged with care, the teapot placed at a precise angle, the small accompaniments positioned, as though their arrangement might prevent disorder elsewhere. He set the tray down. "Shall I pour, sir?" he asked. "Yes," said Mr. Ashcombe. The process began. Each cup was filled with a measured consistency, each offered with a slight inclination. There was no variation in the sequence, no deviation from the expected. And yet, as Miss Sloane accepted her cup, she said, "You poured differently earlier." The remark was delivered lightly. Mr. Harrow paused. "Madam, at luncheon," she said. "The sherry, you offered it from the left." There was a brief silence. "I regret if there was any inconsistency, madam," he said. Mrs. Dalrymple looked up. "I am sure it is of no importance." "None at all," said Mr. Penbury. Miss Sloane stirred her tea. "Of course not." The matter might have ended there. Instead, she added, "It is only that one forms expectations." Mr. Harrow inclined his head. "I shall endeavour to meet them, madam." His tone was unchanged. And yet, something in the exchange had shifted. Mrs. Dalrymple lifted her cup. "A most excellent blend," she said, after a sip. "Yes," Mr. Penbury agreed. "Very agreeable." Miss Sloane tasted hers. "Quite." There was a pause. Then, as though prompted by some internal adjustment, Mr. Penbury spoke again. "I recall," he said, "that during luncheon Mr. Ashcombe had just begun to speak of—" He stopped. "Of what?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked. "I cannot quite remember." Miss Sloane looked at him. "You were about to discuss health," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Yes, that was it." "Though not in any detail," she added. "No," he said, "no detail." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned slightly. "I remember it differently." "In what way?" Miss Sloane asked. "I thought," she said, "that we had moved on to another subject." Mr. Penbury shook his head. "No, I am quite certain." "Certainty," Miss Sloane said, "is often a matter of arrangement." Mrs. Dalrymple set her cup down. "I do not see why it should matter." "No," Miss Sloane agreed. "It should not." Mr. Ashcombe, who had been silent during this exchange, now spoke. "It does not," he said. The firmness of his tone suggested that the question, though unimportant, had nevertheless been settled. Mr. Harrow continued to serve. He offered more tea, adjusted a spoon, moved a small plate by a fraction of an inch. Each action was precise. Each action was correct. And yet, there was a quality to his movements that was not entirely aligned with the ease of habit. Miss Sloane watched him. "When did you first notice it?" she asked, suddenly. Mr. Penbury looked up. "Notice what?" "The sound," she said. He hesitated. "I am not sure." Mrs. Dalrymple considered. "It was after the main course." "No," said Mr. Penbury. "Before." Miss Sloane nodded slightly. "You see." "See what?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked. "That we do not agree." Mr. Ashcombe set his cup down. "I do not think," he said, "that the precise timing of an indistinct noise is of any consequence." "No," Miss Sloane said, "not of consequence." Mr. Harrow stood still for a moment. Then, As though recalling himself, he resumed his duties. Mrs. Dalrymple lifted her cup again. "It is remarkable," she said, "how easily memory can mislead." "Is it misleading?" Miss Sloane asked, "or simply selective?" Mr. Penbury frowned. "I should not like to think that one's recollection is unreliable." "No," she said, "nor should I." Mr. Ashcombe rose. "I believe," he said, "that we have given the matter more attention than it deserves." There was a quiet finality in the statement. Mrs. Dalrymple nodded. "Quite right." Mr. Penbury agreed. Miss Sloane did not object. Mr. Harrow collected the empty cups. As he lifted Miss Sloane's, their eyes met briefly. There was nothing in his expression, nothing at all. And yet, as he turned away, she said, "It is curious." No one asked her to explain. Perhaps because they suspected that the explanation would not be entirely comfortable, or perhaps because in some unspoken way they had already begun to understand that the afternoon had moved beyond the point at which such explanations could be easily contained. The tea, like the luncheon before it, had served its purpose. It had provided structure, it had offered distraction, and it had revealed, in the smallest of ways, that what had been observed and what had been remembered might not be quite the same thing. The conclusion of tea did not arrive with the usual sense of completion. Cups were emptied, plates gathered, and the tray removed with the same careful precision as before. Yet the act itself seemed to leave something unresolved, as though the expected finality had been quietly withheld. Mr. Harrow withdrew once more, carrying the remains of the service with him. For a moment, no one spoke. It was Mr. Penbury who shifted first, moving slightly away from the mantel as though the position had ceased to offer the reassurance he had expected. "One does not often find," he began, then paused, as though uncertain how the sentence ought to proceed. "No," said Miss Sloane, not unkindly, "one does not." Mrs. Dalrymple rose again, though without any clear purpose. "I wonder," she said, "whether it is time to consider departure." The suggestion, while natural, did not immediately produce agreement. Mr. Ashcombe remained standing near the door, his posture attentive, though not in a manner that suggested readiness to bid farewell. "There is no urgency," he said. "No," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. "Of course not." And yet, the absence of urgency seemed itself to create a kind of delay. Miss Sloane moved toward the small writing desk she had observed earlier. She did not touch it, but stood near enough to suggest an interest that was not entirely idle. "One finds," she said, "that the moment of departure is often the most revealing." "In what way?" Mr. Penbury asked. "In that it clarifies what has not been said." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a faint smile. "My dear Miss Sloane, you make even the simplest matters sound quite involved." "Simplicity," she replied, "is often an arrangement." Before Mrs. Dalrymple could respond, there came the sound of movement in the hall. Not hurried, not concealed, but sufficiently distinct to draw attention. Mr. Ashcombe turned toward the door. A moment later, it opened. The man who entered did so without the hesitation of a guest uncertain of his welcome, yet without the ease of one entirely expected. He was of middle height, with a coat that had been brushed with care but not recently pressed. His expression, while composed, carried a trace of impatience, as though his arrival had been delayed beyond his preference. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, with a slight inclination of his head. "Mr. Calthorpe," Mr. Ashcombe replied. The names settled briefly in the room. Mrs. Dalrymple glanced at Miss Sloane. Mr. Penbury adjusted his stance. "You were not expected until later," Mr. Ashcombe continued. "I find," Mr. Calthorpe said, "that expectations are often improved by adjustment." There was a pause. "Indeed?" said Miss Sloane. Mr. Ashcombe gestured toward the others. "You are acquainted with Mrs. Dalrymple and Mr. Penbury, I believe, Miss Sloane." Introductions were acknowledged with the necessary degree of civility. Mr. Calthorpe's manner was correct, though it lacked the faint softness that marked the others. There was a directness to him that sat somewhat uneasily within the room. "I hope I do not intrude," he said. "Not at all," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. "No intrusion," Mr. Penbury added. Miss Sloane inclined her head. On the contrary, the words were polite. The tone, perhaps, less so. Mr. Calthorpe remained standing. "I had understood," he said, "that there were matters to be discussed." "There are," Mr. Ashcombe said, "though the timing may not be ideal." Mr. Calthorpe glanced briefly at the others. "I do not object to witnesses," he said. Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened slightly. "I assure you," she said, "we are not here in that capacity." "No?" he replied. "Of course." And yet his gaze lingered a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Miss Sloane stepped slightly away from the desk. "One finds," she said, "that the presence of others often alters the nature of a conversation." "Does it?" Mr. Calthorpe asked. "Almost always." Mr. Ashcombe moved closer to him. "Perhaps," he said, "we might speak elsewhere." Mr. Calthorpe considered this. "If you prefer." There was a faint emphasis on the last word. Before either could move, the door opened again. Mr. Harrow entered. He paused just inside the room, his gaze passing briefly over the assembled group before settling on Mr. Ashcombe. "Sir," he said. Mr. Ashcombe turned. "Yes? There is a matter that requires your attention." The phrase, so similar to those used earlier, did not pass unnoticed. Mr. Calthorpe's expression sharpened slightly. "I seem," he said, "to have arrived at a moment of considerable attention." "No more than usual," Mr. Ashcombe replied. Mr. Harrow remained still. "It is of some urgency, sir." There was a brief silence. Mr. Ashcombe nodded. "Very well." He turned back to Mr. Calthorpe. "If you will excuse me once more." Mr. Calthorpe inclined his head. "I shall endeavour to remain." The remark, though lightly delivered, carried a faint suggestion of persistence. Mr. Ashcombe left the room, followed by Mr. Harrow. The door closed behind them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Dalrymple exhaled. "This is most irregular." Mr. Penbury nodded. "Quite." Miss Sloane regarded Mr. Calthorpe. "You are acquainted with the household, I take it?" "To a degree," he said. "Enough to arrive unannounced." "I was not unannounced." "No," she said, "merely early." Mr. Penbury shifted again. "I believe," he said, "that punctuality is generally preferred." "Preference," Mr. Calthorpe replied, "is not always practicable." Mrs. Dalrymple moved toward the window. "I cannot imagine what could require such repeated attention." "No," said Miss Sloane, "it is difficult to imagine." Mr. Calthorpe remained where he was, his gaze moving briefly toward the door through which Mr. Ashcombe had departed. "One finds," he said, "that certain matters resist imagination." Miss Sloane watched him. "And yet," she said, "they occur." "Yes," he replied. The agreement was immediate. Outside, the light had begun to fade more noticeably. Within the room, the sense of delay had deepened into something more defined. Time was no longer passing unnoticed. It was being observed, measured, considered. Mr. Penbury glanced at the clock. "It has been some minutes," he said. Mrs. Dalrymple turned. "I am sure there is an explanation." "Yes," said Miss Sloane, "there is always an explanation." Mr. Calthorpe did not speak. He remained standing, his presence now fully established within the room, not as a guest, not entirely as an intruder, but as something else, something that did not depart when it ought to, something that, once arrived, remained, and in remaining, altered the balance of the afternoon in a way that could no longer be overlooked. Mr. Calthorpe did not take a seat. This, in itself, might have passed unnoticed under other circumstances, but in the drawing-room of Briarwood House, where chairs seemed arranged precisely to encourage their use, it carried a certain implication. "You prefer to stand," Miss Sloane observed, not as a question, I prefer not to settle too quickly, he replied. A useful instinct, she said. Mrs. Dalrymple, who had resumed her position near the window, turned slightly. I should have thought, she said, that one might find comfort in settling. Comfort, Mr. Calthorpe said, is not always the point. Mr. Penbury, who had remained near the mantel, shifted again, his movements acquiring a faint restlessness. One does wonder, he said, whether we are in a position to— To what? Miss Sloane asked. To form any view of the matter, he said. Miss Sloane considered this. One is always forming a view, she said, whether one acknowledges it or not. Mrs. Dalrymple frowned slightly. I do not think it appropriate to speculate. No, Miss Sloane agreed. It rarely is. Mr. Calthorpe glanced toward the door. Appropriateness, he said, has a tendency to arrive after the fact. There was a pause. The room, which had once seemed designed for ease, now appeared to contain its occupants with a quiet insistence. Mrs. Dalrymple folded her hands. I have always found, she said, that reputation is the most reliable guide in such situations. Is it? Miss Sloane asked. Certainly, Mrs. Dalrymple replied. One knows where one stands with people of established character. Mr. Penbury nodded. Yes, quite. Miss Sloane's gaze shifted briefly to Mr. Calthorpe. And what, in your view, constitutes establishment? Mrs. Dalrymple seemed momentarily taken aback. Well, she said, consistency, of course. Conduct over time, the absence of irregularity. Mr. Calthorpe allowed himself a faint smile. Absence is an interesting measure. Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened slightly. I do not see what you mean. No, he said. I imagine not. Mr. Penbury cleared his throat. I believe, he said, that Mr. Harrow would be considered a man of excellent reputation. Yes, Mrs. Dalrymple agreed quickly. Entirely so. Miss Sloane did not immediately respond. Instead, she moved a little closer to the center of the room, her attention shifting from one speaker to another with quiet deliberation. And upon what? She asked. Is that assessment based? Mr. Penbury looked uncertain. His conduct, he said. Which conduct? All of it, he replied, with less conviction. Mrs. Dalrymple intervened. He has served here for years, without incident. Yes, Miss Sloane said, without incident. The phrase echoed lightly. Mr. Calthorpe turned his gaze toward her. You place some weight on that word. It seems to have been introduced earlier, she said. I find it useful to retain it. Mr. Penbury shifted again. I do not think, he said, that we are in a position to question Mr. Harrow. No, Miss Sloane agreed. We are not. Mrs. Dalrymple exhaled, as though relieved by the concession. Then we are agreed. Miss Sloane glanced toward the door. Agreement, she said, is often provisional. Mr. Calthorpe gave a slight nod, particularly when based on incomplete information. Mrs. Dalrymple's expression tightened. I do not care for insinuation. Nor do I, Miss Sloane said. There was a brief silence. Mr. Penbury looked toward the clock again. It has been a considerable time, he said. Yes, Mrs. Dalrymple replied. It has. Mr. Calthorpe remained still. Time, he said, has a way of altering perspective. Miss Sloane regarded him. In what way? In that it allows certain impressions to settle, he said, and others to dissipate. Mrs. Dalrymple turned from the window. I have no impressions to settle. No, Miss Sloane said. Of course not. Mr. Penbury attempted a smile. I should think, he said, that we are all quite clear in our minds. Clarity, Miss Sloane replied, is often the last thing to arrive. The remark was met with a quiet stillness. Outside, the fading light had begun to press more noticeably against the windows, softening the edges of the garden and drawing the room inward. Mr. Calthorpe moved at last, though only a step. as if adjusting his position within a space that no longer quite suited him. "You speak as though something has already been decided," he said. Miss Sloane met his gaze. "On the contrary," she said, "nothing has been decided." "Then why the interest in reputation?" "Because," she replied, "it is often the first thing offered and the last thing examined." Mrs. Dalrymple shook her head. "I cannot agree." "No," Miss Sloane said. "I did not expect you to." Mr. Penbury looked between them. "I should prefer," he said, "to wait for Mr. Ashcombe's return before forming any conclusions." "A sensible preference," Miss Sloane said. Mr. Calthorpe glanced once more at the door. "One begins to wonder," he said, "whether his return will bring any clarity at all." The question, though lightly phrased, settled into the room with quiet persistence. Mrs. Dalrymple straightened. "I am sure it will." "Yes," Miss Sloane said. "I am sure it will bring something." Mr. Penbury adjusted his cuffs again, though without the earlier precision. The room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of a specific event, but in recognition that something undefined but undeniable was taking shape. Not in action, not yet, but in perception, in the careful arrangement of words, the measured exchange of views, and the subtle shifting of assumptions. The shape of a reputation, once considered fixed, had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, to change. And though no one had yet said so, it was no longer entirely clear whose reputation it was. It was Mrs. Dalrymple who first gave voice to the practical necessity of the hour, though even she seemed uncertain whether it was entirely appropriate. "I cannot imagine," she said, "that we are expected to remain indefinitely." The remark, while reasonable, did not immediately produce movement. Mr. Penbury looked toward the door, then at the clock, and then, as if dissatisfied with both, at the carpet. "One would suppose not," he said. Miss Sloane remained where she was, her attention fixed not on any object in particular, but on the arrangement of the room itself, as though its proportions might offer some indication of what was to come. Mr. Calthorpe had not altered his position. If anything, he appeared more settled in his refusal to sit, as though the act of remaining upright had become, in itself, a form of participation. "It is curious," he said, "how quickly an afternoon may extend beyond its intended shape." Mrs. Dalrymple drew herself up slightly. "I do not see that it has done so." "No," Miss Sloane said, "not yet." There was a brief pause. Then, from somewhere deeper within the house, there came a sound. It was not the same as before. It was clearer, more defined, not loud, but unmistakable in its origin. A voice, or rather, the suggestion of one raised just enough to carry, though not enough to be understood. The effect upon the room was immediate. Mrs. Dalrymple turned sharply. "What was that?" Mr. Penbury stepped toward the door, though he did not reach it. "I believe," he began, then stopped. Miss Sloane did not move. "Conversation," she said. Mr. Calthorpe inclined his head slightly. "Of a kind." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "It did not sound ordinary." "No," Miss Sloane agreed. "It did not." There followed a second sound, lower, abruptly curtailed. Then silence. Mr. Penbury hesitated. "I think," he said, "that perhaps we ought to remain where we are," Miss Sloane said. He looked at her. "Do you think that wise?" "I think it is expected." Mrs. Dalrymple clasped her hands together. "I do not like this." "No," Miss Sloane said. "It is not designed to be liked." Mr. Calthorpe's gaze remained fixed on the door. "One begins to suspect," he said, "that we are being kept." Mrs. Dalrymple turned to him. "Kept? In place," he said. "Not by instruction, by arrangement." Mr. Penbury shifted again. "I do not believe that is the case." "No," Miss Sloane said. "Belief is not required." There was a pause, longer than the others. Then the door opened. Mr. Ashcombe entered. His appearance was, at first glance, unchanged. His coat was unruffled, his expression composed, and yet something in the manner of his return suggested that the afternoon had crossed a threshold from which it could not easily retreat. "My apologies," he said. No one replied immediately. Mrs. Dalrymple found her voice first. "I believe," she said, "that we heard something." Mr. Ashcombe inclined his head. "You may have done." "Was it?" Mr. Penbury began. "An internal matter," Mr. Ashcombe said. The phrase, though familiar, no longer carried the same reassurance. Mrs. Dalrymple looked at him closely. "I trust," she said, "that nothing is seriously amiss." There was the slightest hesitation. "No," he said. Miss Sloane watched him. "Not seriously." The repetition altered the statement. Mr. Ashcombe met her gaze. "No." The denial was precise. It was also, perhaps, incomplete. Mr. Calthorpe took a step forward. "I believe," he said, "that we have matters to discuss." Mr. Ashcombe nodded. "Yes, we do." Mrs. Dalrymple drew back slightly. "I do not think," she said, "that we should intrude upon private business." Miss Sloane glanced at her. "I do not think," she said, "that we are in a position to avoid it." Mr. Penbury looked between them. "I should prefer," he said, "a clearer understanding of the situation." "As would we all," Mr. Ashcombe replied. There was a pause. Then, with a deliberation that suggested the moment had been reached rather than chosen, he added, "There will be no supper this evening." The statement settled into the room with a quiet finality. Mrs. Dalrymple blinked. "No supper? I am afraid not." Mr. Penbury frowned. "That is most unusual." "Yes," said Miss Sloane, "it is." Mr. Calthorpe regarded Mr. Ashcombe steadily. "Unusual," he said, "is not the same as unexplained." Mr. Ashcombe did not immediately reply. Instead, he moved slightly further into the room, as though adjusting his position in relation to the others. "It would be best," he said, "if you remained here for the time being." The words were spoken with courtesy. They were not a request. Mrs. Dalrymple's composure faltered. "Remain? Only for a short while." Mr. Penbury's unease became more apparent. "I do not understand." "No," Miss Sloane said, "you do not." Mr. Calthorpe's expression did not change. "Is this," he asked, "a matter that concerns us?" Mr. Ashcombe looked at him. "Yes." The answer was immediate. Mrs. Dalrymple sank back into her chair. "This is quite intolerable." "No," Miss Sloane said quietly. "It is quite deliberate." There was a silence. Not the earlier kind, which had been filled with the absence of information. This was different. It was shaped, defined by what had been said and by what had not. Mr. Ashcombe turned toward the door once more. "I shall return shortly," he said. Before anyone could respond, he left the room again. The door closed. Mrs. Dalrymple pressed her hands together. "I cannot imagine," she said, "what this can mean." Mr. Penbury did not answer. Miss Sloane remained still. Mr. Calthorpe exhaled slowly. "One finds," he said, "that meaning is often withheld until it can no longer be avoided." Miss Sloane inclined her head. "Yes." Outside, the light had nearly gone. Inside, the room held its occupants in a quiet suspension. No supper would be served. No explanation had been given, and in the absence of both, the afternoon had resolved itself into something else entirely. Not an event, not yet, but a condition defined less by what had occurred than by what had been carefully and persistently left unsaid. The absence of supper introduced a stillness that no arrangement of furniture could soften. It was not merely the interruption of routine, but the removal of an expectation so deeply embedded that its absence felt less like omission and more like alteration. Mrs. Dalrymple adjusted her position once more, though she did not rise. "I cannot recall," she said, "a single occasion in which such a thing has occurred?" Mr. Penbury nodded, though his agreement seemed less certain than before. "No," he said, "nor can I." Miss Sloane remained seated, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her attention directed not toward any individual, but toward the collective arrangement of them all. "Memory," she said, "is often guided by what one expects to find." Mrs. Dalrymple looked at her. "I do not see how that applies." "No," Miss Sloane replied, "it rarely does." Mr. Calthorpe had moved at last, though only slightly. He stood nearer the center of the room now, as though the periphery had ceased to provide sufficient vantage. "One becomes aware," he said, "of how much is taken for granted." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "I take nothing for granted." "No," Miss Sloane said, "you accept it." Mr. Penbury glanced toward the door again. "It has been some time," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. "Too much time." Miss Sloane turned her head slightly. "Time," she said, "is not passing unnoticed." "No," Mr. Calthorpe agreed. "It is being considered." There was a pause. The room, which had once accommodated conversation with ease, now seemed to contain it with a quiet insistence. Words, when they came, did not disperse readily. They lingered, attaching themselves to the spaces between the speakers. Mrs. Dalrymple exhaled. "I do not like this arrangement." "No," Miss Sloane said. "It was not designed to be liked." Mr. Penbury shifted again, his movements now marked by a faint unease that he no longer attempted to conceal. "I think," he said, "that we are entitled to some explanation." Miss Sloane regarded him. "Entitlement," she said, "is rarely decisive." Mr. Calthorpe's gaze remained fixed on the door. "One begins to wonder," he said, "whether explanation is being delayed or constructed." Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened. "I cannot imagine that anything is being constructed." "No," Miss Sloane said. "One does not imagine such things." The remark was not elaborated. It did not need to be. Mr. Penbury attempted to recover a degree of composure. "I have always found," he said, "that Mr. Ashcombe conducts his affairs with clarity." "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple agreed quickly. "Entire clarity." Miss Sloane inclined her head slightly. "Clarity," she said, "is often a matter of perspective." Mr. Calthorpe allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, particularly when shared. Mrs. Dalrymple rose at last. "I cannot remain seated in this manner indefinitely." "No," Miss Sloane said. "Movement is often preferable." Mrs. Dalrymple crossed the room, her steps measured, her posture maintained with deliberate care. She paused near the small writing desk, though she did not touch it. "I recall," she said, "that this room has always been most agreeable." "Has it?" Miss Sloane asked. "Certainly," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. "There has never been any discomfort here." Miss Sloane's gaze followed her. "Never?" "Not that I can remember." Mr. Penbury nodded. "Yes, quite so." Mr. Calthorpe turned slightly. "Familiarity," he said, "has a tendency to smooth irregularities." Mrs. Dalrymple looked at him. "I do not see what you mean." "No," he said, "I imagine not." Miss Sloane rose. "Familiarity," she said, "also creates expectations." Mr. Penbury frowned faintly. "I should think that is its purpose." "Yes," she said, "and its limitation." There was a brief silence. The light in the room had shifted further, the edges of objects now softened by the encroaching dusk. Shadows gathered not dramatically, but with a quiet persistence that altered the character of the space. Mrs. Dalrymple turned back toward the others. "I cannot believe," she said, "that we are to remain here without any further information." "No," Miss Sloane said, "you cannot." Mr. Penbury looked again at the clock. "It is most irregular." "Yes," Mr. Calthorpe replied, "it is." The agreement did not resolve anything. It merely confirmed the condition. Miss Sloane moved a step closer to the center of the room. "One finds," she said, "that the weight of a situation is often carried not by what is present, but by what is expected." Mrs. Dalrymple regarded her. "I expect nothing more than an explanation." "Yes," Miss Sloane said, "and in the absence of it." Mrs. Dalrymple did not answer. Mr. Penbury shifted once more. "I should not like to think," he said, "that we are being deliberately kept uninformed." "No," Miss Sloane replied, "nor should you." Mr. Calthorpe's gaze did not leave the door. "One becomes aware," he said, "that familiarity can obscure as much as it reveals." Mrs. Dalrymple drew herself up. "I do not feel obscured." "No," Miss Sloane said. "You feel assured." The distinction, though slight, settled into the room with quiet persistence. Mr. Penbury looked between them. "I have always trusted," he said, "in the order of such things." "Yes," Miss Sloane replied. "Order is most reassuring." Mr. Calthorpe inclined his head slightly. "Until it alters." The words did not require emphasis. They were sufficient in themselves. Outside, the last of the light receded. Inside, the room seemed to draw inward, its familiar arrangements now carrying a different weight, not of comfort, but of expectation. Each object remained where it had always been. Each person occupied a position that could, under other circumstances, have been described as entirely natural. And yet the familiarity of it all had begun to press upon them, not as reassurance, but as a quiet, persistent reminder that what had once been accepted without question was no longer quite so easily sustained. The weight of it did not announce itself. It settled, gradually, inescapably, and in doing so, it prepared the ground for something that had not yet been spoken but could no longer be indefinitely deferred. The door opened again, more deliberately this time, and Mr. Ashcombe entered with a calmness that seemed measured against the tension that had accumulated in his absence. His presence altered the room without sound. It was the subtle shifting of balance, the acknowledgement that some pattern had reached a point where it could no longer remain obscured. "Thank you for remaining patient," he said, his tone neutral yet edged with a quiet authority. "I realize it has been trying." Mrs. Dalrymple inclined her head, though her hands remained clasped tightly before her. "It has been unusual," she said. "Yes," Miss Sloane remarked, "in ways that are difficult to articulate until one is asked to do so." Mr. Penbury adjusted his coat, a gesture that seemed to express both discomfort and preparedness. "I hope you will forgive my insistence, but we have been left with little understanding of what is occurring." Mr. Ashcombe moved closer to the center, not hastily, but with a precision that implied the deliberation of long practice. "You are correct," he admitted, "and that is precisely why I have asked you to remain. The situation requires attention to sequence, to context, to the subtleties of timing and interaction." Miss Sloane's gaze remained calm, but her eyes hinted at the calculation beneath. "Subtleties often elude those not accustomed to observing them," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "And yet, even when observed, they may mislead. It is the arrangement of truths, rather than the immediate perception of them, that conveys clarity." Mrs. Dalrymple's lips pressed together. "Arrangement of truths," she repeated. "Does that imply some have been withheld?" "Not withheld," Mr. Ashcombe corrected, "but deferred. Timing is part of truth, as is context. Without both, information may appear distorted, incomplete, or alarming." Mr. Penbury cleared his throat. "And the sounds we heard?" "An internal matter," Mr. Ashcombe said simply. "Relevant, but not dangerous. A complication, perhaps, but one that requires consideration before commentary." Mr. Calthorpe, as was his manner, leaned back slightly, studying him. "So we are expected to reconcile expectation with observation." "In a sense," Mr. Ashcombe acknowledged. "Observation without guidance leads to assumptions. Assumptions, even rational ones, can be misleading." Miss Sloane inclined her head. "Meaning that what we infer from absence or interruption is rarely the whole story." "Precisely," he said. "And that is the lesson of today's occurrences. Each gesture, each pause, each omission carries weight, but the weight must be understood in relation to all other elements. Mrs. Dalrymple exhaled slowly. I see. And so, remaining here allows us to witness this arrangement? Yes, he replied. It is less about restriction than participation. You are not idle. You are part of a deliberate sequence that will reveal itself fully. Mr. Penbury's unease persisted, but he nodded. I imagine patience will be required. Indeed, Mr. Ashcombe said. Patience, observation, and reflection. The truths of this house are not presented at once. They are disclosed in their proper order, such that understanding is not fragmented or misleading. Miss Sloane's gaze swept the room slowly, resting on each occupant before returning to Mr. Ashcombe. And when that order is complete, we will know? Entirely, he said, though what we know will often be more a matter of comprehension than revelation. Understanding does not always resemble the immediate dramatic disclosure one might anticipate. Mrs. Dalrymple clasped her hands together again, this time more firmly. Then we remain and observe what is laid before us? Yes, he replied. As participants in an arrangement that is neither arbitrary nor casual. Every action, every reaction, every hesitation contributes to the whole. Mr. Calthorpe exhaled, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. A most civilized instruction, though one cannot help but notice the tension it carries beneath its civility. Indeed, Mr. Ashcombe agreed. Civilized, deliberate, necessary. And it is precisely in that space, the measured, the deliberate, the observed, that clarity resides. The room settled into a careful equilibrium. It was no longer simply a matter of waiting or of discomfort. It had become an exercise in attention, a recognition that each small gesture, each sound, each movement contributed to an underlying architecture of truth. Outside, the last light of day receded completely, leaving shadows that softened and shifted against familiar surfaces. Inside, the occupants understood that the unfolding sequence demanded both their presence and their comprehension. The arrangement was in motion, but its resolution, like the final pieces of a complex design, remained just beyond immediate perception. And in that awareness, quiet acceptance took root, tempered by the knowledge that the next revelation would emerge only when all elements were properly aligned, and that nothing could be accelerated without disrupting the balance of truths already in motion. The house, long accustomed to the rhythms of its residents, seemed to pause as if anticipating the culmination of unspoken adjustments. Mr. Ashcombe moved quietly among them, not with the briskness of authority, but with the deliberate precision of someone aligning scattered notes into a coherent score. Every glance, every tilt of the head appeared calibrated, and in that calibration lay an unspoken promise. Clarity would emerge, not in a flourish, but through subtle guidance. Mrs. Dalrymple, who had been seated near the window, adjusted her shawl with careful attention, as if the motion itself lent her courage. I find, she said, that I am uncertain how much is to be revealed at once. Uncertainty is itself informative, Mr. Ashcombe replied. It shapes expectation, which in turn shapes observation. What is omitted temporarily can illuminate what is presented fully. Mr. Penbury shifted slightly, his gaze moving from the fireplace to the bookcase and back again, as though the room's familiar details now carried new significance. Then our impressions may have been flawed, he said, not by inaccuracy, but by incompleteness. Exactly, Mr. Ashcombe said, and it is precisely why we must treat each element, each hesitation, each minor misalignment as intentional until proven otherwise. Miss Sloane's eyes remained calm but sharp. And when a misalignment is corrected? She asked. Then understanding follows naturally, he said. Not with spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability that emerges when errors are acknowledged and adjusted. Mr. Calthorpe, leaning lightly against the corner of the writing desk, allowed a faint smile. So the house itself participates in instruction. its rhythms, its silences, its irregularities, each corrected or noted, each serving to refine perception. Precisely, Mr. Ashcombe agreed. The process is subtle. It is not the volume of revelation that matters, but the coherence it achieves when viewed as a whole. A faint rustle at the far end of the room drew attention, yet it was not the interruption one might anticipate. A curtain shifted, a chair scraped lightly against the floor, and the house seemed to breathe once, settling all motion into a single, quiet cadence. Mrs. Dalrymple rose, stepping forward with deliberate care. "And the minor confusions we experienced, are these also considered part of the design?" "Yes," Mr. Ashcombe replied. "They are minor, but they serve a function. Misplaced expectation is corrected by observation, and observation is sharpened when the mind is engaged by gentle dissonance." Miss Sloane inclined her head slowly. "Then, what seemed irregular was, in fact, an opportunity for refinement." "Exactly," he said. "The house, the behaviors, the hesitation, all elements of an arrangement designed, not for disorder, but for comprehension." Mr. Penbury exhaled softly. "I believe I am beginning to perceive the pattern, though its contours are still faint." "And that," Mr. Ashcombe said quietly, "is sufficient. Understanding is often more cumulative than instantaneous. Each small correction contributes to the whole, and only when all pieces are aligned can clarity be recognized." Mrs. Dalrymple glanced around the room, noting the shadows and the softened edges of familiar furniture, each now subtly defined by the interplay of expectation and observation. "So it is less a revelation than an adjustment?" "Precisely," he confirmed. "The quiet correction is rarely dramatic. It is a process of bringing what is known, what is assumed, and what is observed into harmony." Mr. Calthorpe's voice, calm yet deliberate, broke the silence. "And once this harmony is achieved?" Mr. Ashcombe allowed himself a faint nod. "Then the truths, once diffuse and tentative, settle into their rightful places. The arrangement is complete not because all questions are answered at once, but because each action, each response, each hesitation has been measured, observed, and acknowledged." A stillness, different from previous tensions, filled the room. It was not the absence of motion, but the presence of order in subtle form. Shadows and light, the positions of chairs, the faint scent of evening air, the unspoken responses of those present, all had been considered, all had been corrected where needed, and all now contributed to a quiet equilibrium that demanded no declaration, no flourish, no overt conclusion. Mrs. Dalrymple, Miss Sloane, Mr. Penbury, and Mr. Calthorpe understood without explicit statement that the process had reached its natural conclusion, not with dramatic revelation, but with the subtle realignment that left the house and its occupants in precise, unforced comprehension. And in that quiet completion, each participant sensed the invisible architecture of truth, fully arranged, finally intelligible, and sustained by the delicate balance of observation, patience, and correction